one of the things that Jews have that I can say that I grew up with, and so did the man I talked to, the former DJ who'd become Jewish as well. We have, and I described it this way, family-driven cultures of elite-level competence, meaning that when I was a kid, being a doctor or lawyer that's it.
Yeah.
Like I had one job. My job was to get into an elite-level university and become a doctor or a lawyer.
Right.
And that's very real, right? And so that there's no plan B, right? Burn the ships.
At the heart of every great civilization stands a breed of men forged by virtue. Men who wield strength and wisdom with the gravity of their responsibilities. Builders, protectors, providers, leaders. They shape the world they inhabit with a calloused hand and sharpened mind. The downfall of civilizations is often traced to the proliferation of weak men, ruled by their passions, fleeing from duty and blind to the heights they were meant to scale. We live in an age where masculinity is not just questioned, but sabotaged. Emotional blackmail has replaced reason. Envy fuels our social contracts. The result? A generation of men tamed into timidity. But make no mistake, an antidote does exist. Many are awakening to the madness, reclaiming their masculinity, not as a trend, but as a birthright. Yet the battlefield remains treacherous. Too many young men, hungry for direction, fall prey to anyone with a microphone, sunglasses, and a red pill promising escape from a shadowy matrix. We need to be in the business of providing a compelling, patriarchal vision that includes raising strong sons, investing in multiple generations, and helping men around us live with virtue. This is not just a call to arms, it's a summons to the soul. A formidable gentleman is no mere mortal in a crowd of shadows. He is a man forged by fire, tempered by truth, and crowned with purpose. He embraces his God-given masculinity, not as a relic of the past, but as a banner for the truth. He is a master of disciplines, spiritual, physical, emotional, and intellectual. He trains his heart to discern truth from treachery, stands unyielding in the faith, and perfects the art of manliness with the precision of a warrior sharpening his blade. He is above reproach, faithful to one woman, bound by covenant, not convenience. He treasures fatherhood as a sacred charge, respects authority not out of fear, but because he understands the weight of responsibility. He takes the helm of his life with a steady hand, never shrinking from duty. He is self-controlled, his passions mastered, not dismissed. This man does not drift. He subdues the chaos around him and within himself. He is a man of dominion, reclaiming ground, faithfully stewarding every space he inhabits. His moral compass is unflinching. He loves what is good and hates what is evil. He dresses well, not for vanity, but because he understands that bearing matters. His posture commands respect. His presence is felt. He walks the earth with the dignity of a man who knows he's on a mission. He has high esteem for others, honors femininity, and holds himself to a compelling standard of class, not the shallow respectability of vain cowards, but the deep integrity of kings. He is not passive. He is not weak. He casts off immaturity and ignorance like the tattered rags of boyhood. He marches forward into the storm of mature manhood, eyes fixed on the horizon. He depends on the grace of God alone. He repents of sin swiftly, lives humbly, and fears no man. His strength is gentle, power harnessed, ready to be exercised and not vainly flaunted. He protects those entrusted to him, provides with diligence, and leads with the sturdy confidence of a man who knows whom he serves. He is a warrior on the front line, a hunter of truth, and a poet in the quiet moments when battle subsides. He never stops learning. Wisdom is his lifelong quarry. His aim? to ascend to the status of sage, one whose words carry weight and whose counsel shapes multiple generations. He is God's man, faithful when the world demands compromise, true when the cost is high. His ultimate aim, the glory of God, always. Today, I am joined by my friend, Will Spencer. He has an incredible story worth hearing and has devoted himself to mastering the art of masculinity. Will is a storyteller, an adventurer who journeyed from Stanford University and the dot-com boom through 30 countries. He's explored global spiritual traditions ranging from meditation in the Himalayas to the ayahuasca retreats in the Amazon. The Lord found him at the Burning Man Festival in Nevada. Now he hosts the Will Spencer podcast, interviewing thought leaders, exposing the darkness of the new age, and helping men reclaim their godly authority. Will Spencer, welcome to Of Flames and Crowns.
Lennox, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Absolutely. Now, you got such an interesting story, Will, the kind of story that I don't think I could ever get tired of hearing. You've been around the world. You have seen and met all kinds of people, explored so many different kinds of ideas. And now you find yourself in this incredible position to influence people with an anchor in Christ and the fact that he saved you. So where does a story begin for you? Where do you usually like to start your story? How did you get to where you are today?
I think the best place to start the story is at the beginning. So I grew up in one of the most unlikely places compared to where I am today, which is a Jewish family in Phoenix, Arizona. So my whole family was Jewish, Reformed Jewish. So we would be what I would call religious but not spiritual. Perhaps you've heard many people in the New Age, which I'm sure we'll get to, describe themselves as spiritual but not religious.
Right.
We were religious but not spiritual. So we celebrated all the high holidays, so Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, downtown at Symphony Hall. We celebrated Passover in Hebrew, Hanukkah but not Christmas. I was bar mitzvahed, the whole thing. So that's probably the best place for me to begin.
Yeah. And then I think at some point you went on some journey around the world.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. What prompted that journey specifically?
That was something that I was, say, inspired or desired to do beginning in the year 2000. So New Year's Eve 2000. So part of what was happening at the time is I was in the dot-com boom at Stanford University. So the global rave scene, DJ, electronic music, that was starting to happen. So I went to a rave that night for the first time. My sister took me, and I'm ashamed to say, but it's true.
Yeah.
I took a substance, ecstasy, and I had discovered this desire inside myself to travel the world.
Yeah.
And now I didn't grow up with a family that traveled at all. It was never anything that I felt that was lacking in my life. But suddenly I had this drive to go do it that stuck with me for 15 years. It didn't go away. It was something that sort of became a little bit like a North Star, guiding me towards, okay, stay focused in this direction, make choices that enable this trip and prevent it, and don't make choices that prevent it from happening.
Right.
So it was a 15-year process to get there from 2000 to essentially 2015.
Yeah. And was it just a curiosity about the world that prompted this, or was it that you were looking for something deeper?
Very much that.
Okay.
It was very much a journey of both self-exploration and a journey to see what was out there. I've always been intensely spiritually curious. And that goes back to even when I was a little kid. Everyone else is reading like the Hardy Boys, and I'm reading Bigfoot.
Some of my favorites, by the way.
Right, yeah.
Boys. So that's awesome, yeah.
So there was definitely a desire, a drive to understand what I might at the time have called the mystery. So to explore different spiritual traditions, even before I knew sort of what that meant. There was an intense curiosity about spiritual, theological, and perhaps philosophical questions.
Right. So what did you find on this journey? First, where did you go? And what did you find wherever you went?
So I started in South America. So I started in Buenos Aires and went from Buenos Aires in Argentina south down to Ushuaia, the southernmost tip of South America.
Okay.
From there, I went to Torres del Paine in Chile, which is the Jewel National Park of Patagonia.
Okay.
Went to Peru and then Ecuador and Colombia. From there, I went to Asia, including Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, China. I've also been to Oceania, which is Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Vanuatu, and then, let's see, Thailand. I think I might have mentioned Mongolia, China, and then finished in India, Sri Lanka, and Nepal.
Okay, interesting.
But I had previously been to Western Europe, and I've been to Morocco.
Yeah, okay.
So, which is part of Africa.
Yeah,
so I guess say
it is. You've been all around the world, quite literally.
I have.
How was the food in all these places?
Different.
It
depends on which country.
Right. Which foods did you particularly enjoy?
Well, so the best food that you can find in the world of all different cuisines, I think, is in Japan. Obviously, France is incredible for French cuisine. Right.
Yes.
But in Japan, you have to fight to have a bad meal. Like
wow.
You can go to like a 7-Eleven, their equivalent of the 7-Eleven, like Famine Mart, and you can get sushi in a plastic tray that is as good as anything you get in an American restaurant. Wow. And so if that's what you can get at the sort of the corner store, imagine what you can find in restaurants. The skill, the precision, the care that they put into the food that they make shows through into the rest of the civilization as well. There's a good side to that, and there's a bad side to it as well.
Sure. So did this trip around the world satisfy your curiosity? Did you achieve what you wanted to achieve in this? Okay.
I did. Yeah. What an incredible question. Thank you.
Sure.
I did.
Yeah.
It satisfied my curiosity to understand the world in an earthly sense.
Right.
And it also satisfied my curiosity to understand, we'll say, the world in a spiritual sense. Yeah. Very much so. Very much so, particularly India. Now, India came at the very end. That was at the conclusion of the journey, just before Nepal. Right. And I look back on the trip now leading up to India, and it was essentially 3 years of training to be in travel, to be prepared to journey through India the way that I did.
Yeah.
So that was really the end of it. That showed me the final piece of the puzzle that I was ready to see.
Yeah. And what was that piece? Like, how would you identify what that piece was? What was your thought process at the end of this? What specific things were you thinking? What conclusions had you arrived at?
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know that I was fully prepared for what India ended up being.
Right.
But I remember as one of the inheritors of the 1960s hippie tradition. Right. One of the things that the Beatles did was they went to India, I think, during the recording of Sgt. Pepper's. It was a big shift in the Beatles. I can talk forever about the Beatles, and not in a good way, not in a good way, not in a complimentary way. Yeah. But there was a big shift in the middle of the 60s when the Beatles got into Sgt. Pepper's. They went to India. They started spending time with the Maharishi Yogi, and that was when Eastern mysticism flooded into American culture to such a degree that we kind of live in it right now. Like in a very real sense, you can probably say Hinduism is a more present cultural reality in the United States than Christianity is. Yeah, I mean, think like guru is a common word. Right. Avatar, that's the name of a big film. Karma. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so there are these Hindu words. Yoga is huge. 60 million people in the United States practice yoga, including many Christians, and that is a topic. So there's a way in which that's become sort of the lingua franca, spiritual lingua franca of the United States right now. But we don't hear terms like redemption, salvation, right, atonement. These words are not part of our cultural lexicon, but guru, karma, these things are. So that began with, in the public's mind, because it had been happening in the underground for many years, that it began with the Beatles. So the Beatles initiated this cultural wave in the United States of people making pilgrimages to India, right? Americans, Westerners making pilgrimages to India. So I had met enough people who had done that, that there was no bloom left on the lily. I was under no illusions that I was going to a land of great spiritual wisdom, right? Maybe cultural richness, because plenty of Americans thought, oh, India is this utopian spiritual paradise. And they would go and they would spend a week or two there and they'd be like, well, and we're getting out of here, right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So I didn't have any illusions about what India was. But what it taught me, now I want to couch this and say, I have great respect for the Indian people. Right. And I have great appreciation for many aspects of their culture, and I'm very grateful to the nation. I care about it deeply. Yeah. So I want to say this not from a position of like cultural judgment, but appreciation and acknowledgement that every culture has its positives and its negatives, including and especially America. Right. So one of the things that India showed me was things that I had seen elsewhere, which is that when we think about what corruption is in America, we actually, you were talking about this with Aaron Wren. Right. We actually still live in a fairly high trust society. We can here in Moscow, you can leave your your car unlocked and
Yeah.
be pretty safe that your purse or backpack is going to appear in it. And that's still true in many places in the United States, and including in many cities, although not cities like San Francisco.
Right.
But we still have like things run on time. When the power goes out, someone comes to repair it. Right. And you can have a reasonable expectation that you're going to get the job done, and you're going to get the job done well if you give someone the responsibility.
Yes.
So the corruption in the United States, which exists and is very real, is at the very highest level, the very highest institutional levels, high finance, politics, et cetera, media. Right. That's where the corruption exists at the very highest levels. But at the everyday level of people in the United States, we don't generally experience it. On the other hand, when you go to a place like India or many, they're called third world countries, but a better term would be countries that are never going to economically develop.
Sure.
So you have the first world countries, the United States, England, Germany, Japan, et cetera. Those are countries that already have developed.
Right.
Second world countries are countries that are in the process of developing. So Peru is a good example.
Right.
China is another one. Then you have the third world countries, which are countries that are probably never going to economically develop. When you travel to countries that are in the third world, corruption is a pervasive aspect of everyday life.
Yes.
You don't have to pay someone not to do their job.
Right.
In the United States, if you want someone not to do their job, you have to bribe them.
Yeah.
You want the housing inspector to look the other way. Don't do this.
Yeah.
But some people do.
Yes.
In India, and I had Indians explain this to me because as a white Westerner, I experienced the functions of the country very differently.
Yes.
But Indians would explain to me, no, here in India, if I go to this is an Indian man speaking, if I go to the post office, I have to pay someone to do their job.
Do the job, yeah.
So getting to witness the profound amount of corruption that lives in the everyday lives of people in third world countries satisfied a longing that I had to know how the world really worked. Because I grew up in a liberal culture in San Francisco, especially was when I came of age, that had just unvarnished, unbridled hatred for America, for men, for masculinity, for whiteness. Like that was what I was steeped in.
Yeah.
So I believed just how bad America was. Right. But when I went to the rest of the world to see how the rest of the world really works, America existed. It stood up, like many describe it, as a bright, shining light.
Yeah.
And it satisfied my need to understand, everything that I've been told about my own country was a lie. Was a lie. Yes.
Right.
So that's perhaps a long answer to the question on the material side. And I can
Yeah.
speak to the spiritual side as well.
Were you able to draw the connection to Christianity and all of that, recognizing that what made America distinct was Christian influence? Or is that something you were yet to discover? Or, were you able to draw those connections at the time, that is?
Probably not yet.
Yeah.
Because I returned to the United States in February of 2020, just before COVID.
Right.
COVID was not yet really a thing. And that was when I got back here. And that was when I started truly exploring Christianity. Before that, it wasn't really in my mind, but I had observed that a lot of the theological values of Eastern countries definitely played into their everyday expectations. So a good example is Hinduism or Buddhism. Hinduism has, and Buddhism as an extension, has the idea of reincarnation, karma. What you do in this life influences the nature of your birth and the next life. And that cycle of death and rebirth is called, I believe, samsara. And you just do that essentially forever. Buddhism says you can meditate and you can exit from the wheel of death and rebirth. But the idea being, if you're going to die and then you're going to be reborn in another body, and that the good that you do in this life will only marginally increase the improvement of your next life, which, you're essentially borrowing on credit because you have no idea.
Yeah.
Right. So your expectations for what you can achieve in a cyclical theological sense are very minimal.
Right.
Change is very, very slow. If you look at nature, if you were to watch a forest, bloom and go into hibernation in winter as we're going, you'll see a forest change very slowly over long periods of time.
Yeah.
That belief, that expectation is built into the same cyclical theology. And I witnessed that. Like, why would anyone seek to improve the living conditions of people in a nation if they're just going to die and be reborn, or I'm going to die and be reborn marginally better next time? Why should I work to meaningfully improve the state of my civilization? And so I did make the connection between theology and life, maybe sociology.
Right.
I did make that connection, but I didn't understand Christianity well enough to say how Christianity played in the West. Yeah.
Right. So then what was it that you're coming to Christ like? Like what did that look like? And like in terms of timelines, you've been on this big journey. You've just left India, I suppose.
Yeah.
What does the rest of that road look like now as you come into faith in Christ?
So I left to travel in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I returned in 2020.
Okay.
Before I left in 2016.
So you actually, like, were you gone for a solid 4 years?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, I did come back to the United States to visit family and stuff like that. But yeah, I sold everything, car, furniture, got rid of furniture, everything. And I had a carry-on backpack for 4 years.
Wow. Yeah.
If you're going to do something, do it properly.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, you went all in. Yeah.
But again, it was something that I had waited and worked to do for 15 years.
Yeah.
Like, there were many decisions that I did not make, specifically because I knew that this trip was the thing that I wanted.
Right.
And that's a wonderful thing. Like, it's a very few men in all of history have had the means and the opportunity and the motivation to do it, have actually done it, and have done it with the way that I did it. And so I'm profoundly grateful to God for making it possible and keeping me safe through it. Because as we get into some of the spiritual things, like you can see that I was walking in real darkness, unbeknownst to me.
Right.
But regarding coming to Christ, so before I started traveling in 2016, I went to the Burning Man Festival in 2015. Yeah. So this was August 2015. I left the United States in March 2016. So I was just coming off of a breakup of a relationship that was definitely no good for me, was going nowhere. Yeah. I'd managed to exit that relationship with integrity, but I was still grieving. And so I went to the Burning Man Festival, as you do. Yeah. You know, in the Bay Area, you can just find someone with a ticket because everyone's selling tickets, and you just hop a ride and you just go. So I went, and then the following morning, so I think I probably arrived on Friday evening, Tuesday evening. The following morning, I bumped into the man who was camped next to me, just struck up a conversation, said I had just come off a breakup. It's like, well, if you're grieving, you should go to this camp called Spirit Dream, and they can help you out. I just met with them yesterday, and they were great. So I'm like, okay, sounds good to me. So I went over to Camp Spirit Dream that morning, and I ended up in a 3-hour counseling encounter, essentially, with 3 people, Barb, Katie, and a man named Larry, and just had a very profound experience of warmth and welcoming and joyfulness, and just really getting to work through a lot of stuff that was causing me a lot of grief. At the end of that encounter, I guess you would say I had a vision of Christ with my eyes closed. No theological content, just Jesus' face. And I asked them, like, who are you people? Yeah. They're like, we're Christians. Like, what are you doing here? Yeah. And they had been part of a camp, an underground ministry at Burning Man for, at that point, 12 years. Wow. So they felt a call to show up and minister to some of the most lost and seeking people on earth. Burning Man, for those who don't know, is a 80,000 person explicitly pagan festival in the Nevada desert. It's been going on for 20 or so years, and they felt a call to go minister to the people there. And so they had, over 12 years, built up a rather big camp. They didn't advertise that they were Christians. There was no crosses out there. But as I looked at the decorations of the camp, there were obviously no Buddhas, no psychedelic artwork, just a painting of a lion and a bull and an eagle. And I'm like, what are those? Yeah, exactly. Right. And so those people, Camp Spirit Dream, became my friends. Yeah. And so I pursued relationship with them. I ended up flying to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. They live up in Coeur d'Alene for that Christmas. And I remember being welcomed into their homes and their families, and they were so joyful. They were so peaceful. They were singing songs and laughing, and there was just a real feeling of warmth and peace, which they had exported it to Burning Man, but they lived it back in their homes. And it was that Christmas, that was 2015, that really stuck with me. It was the first time that I felt that I had met Christians who truly embodied the faith as somehow I expected it to be. And that was a big shift for me. So then I went to travel. While I was traveling, I kept in touch with them. I told them what they were doing. And they've told me later they were praying for me, like, oh, what's he doing now? But when I returned to the United States in 2020, Rob, who was the leader of the camp, he had purchased the book Simply Christian by N.T. Wright for me. And the day I arrived back in the United States, Rob had shipped it to my friend. The day I arrived back, my friend gave me the book. Wow. So right when I came back from my journey, Christ was waiting for me. Wow. And I started reading Simply Christian, and that began the journey to my baptism that happened a few months later. And I can tell you about that part as well.
Yeah, let's get into it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I mentioned how I had had the longing to understand satisfied by seeing the world for what it is materially. I was also intensely curious about the world theologically. I used to say that I didn't know what I was spiritual but not religious.
Yeah.
I have since discovered that I did actually have a religion, and the religion was called selfism. It's sort of driven by this therapy culture where you have all of these experiences to grow and cultivate the self. It's driven by Jungian psychology was a big part of it. There's a book by a man named Vitz, V-I-T-Z. His last name is like Psychology as Religion, something like that. I've been reading that. I'm reading this like, oh, that was me.
Yeah.
So for me, having all of these experiences was a way towards self and other discovery. That was what motivated me. And so having different theological perspectives was a way of discovering different perspectives on God and different ways of understanding myself. So I had the belief that, well, maybe all religions are equal paths up the mountain to God.
Yeah.
And so I had explored Buddhism and Hinduism and various indigenous traditions and psychedelics and the New Age. Christianity was a difficult one because it's in San Francisco in the Bay Area. It's hard to meet, faithful Christians, or so I believe. It's probably not as hard, but maybe there are a few more there than I realized.
Sure,
but I didn't meet any, and I didn't even know where to look. But so I went traveling, and I had all of these experiences that are driven by two central theological concepts: all is God and all is one. So so all is God is monism. Pantheism.
Pantheism,
And then all is one is monism. And so that was the core theological concept behind all of Eastern mysticism and actually most paganism.
Right.
And Dr. Peter Jones writes about it in his book, One or Two, and then he has another book called The Other Worldview. Okay. And those two books, and he has great videos on YouTube about it as well. Oneism is what he calls that. And so I had been traveling and with this kind of all is one kind of mindset, all religions are equal paths to God, hadn't yet fully explored Christianity, but I had met some good Christians. Right. And so that stuck out in my mind as something like, well, that's going to sit over there. Not sure what to do with that yet, but I acknowledge that it's there. So I was traveling with this all is one kind of mindset. Yeah. And I encountered some information that truly challenged that worldview, which was sort of about like Jeffrey Epstein type stuff and P. Diddy type parties. Yeah. I think these things are just in the American public cultural lexicon now. At the time, that was quite scandalous to talk about. That was about 10 years ago. But I saw the information. I believed that the information was true, right? And so here's a bit of information that challenges my worldview. Yeah. So I had a choice. I could either throw out the information or throw out the worldview. Yeah. Yeah. Because the way that information challenged my worldview was that if all is God, you're telling me that Jeffrey Epstein is also God, that I'm working hard to be a good person, but he's just as much God as I am?
Right. Without effort, without anything, really.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. I mean, he's a genuinely wicked man, one of many, but he's God as well. And then the other notion is kind of driven by karma. So you're telling me that a child who's being sex trafficked, that's their karma? That they did something in a past life to deserve that? That you could look that child in the eye and say, this is your fate, this is your fault in a way, and that it's also Jeffrey Epstein's karma to be that? I found those ideas revolting. I just couldn't stomach it in a very real sense. I was sickened by them. So towards the end of my travels, I would try to talk to people about this. I would say, well, what about this? And I didn't even have to point to Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah. I could point to other wickedness around. Like, you're telling me that's God, or you're telling that's that person's karma? And what I found was a lot of people who would change the subject. They didn't want to talk about it. Right. They would gloss over it. Yeah. And so that left a really clear gap. You could probably write the word evil on it. Right. How do we account for the existence of evil? Yeah. And so I was carrying that question. So when you say, were you satisfied with your travels? Yes, because not only had I seen the way that the rest of the world struggles against everyday corruption that they seek to be liberated from, and that they look to the United States as a beacon of liberation from that corruption. That's why people want to come here. And you can probably speak to that. Yeah. Not that America is perfect. Right. America also has a very dark side, but every country has a dark side. And to look at the countries of the world and say, this is the light of your cultural beauty. This is your particular cultural darkness. America has great cultural light and great cultural darkness, and every culture is struggling with those two. But America's light is able to shine and illuminate the world in part due to the Christian tradition. But we'll get to that for sure. Yeah. So I was struggling with this question of the existence of evil, and I returned to the United States in 2020, and my friend Rob had given me the book Simply Christian by N.T. Wright. And in the book, N.T. Wright describes a scene of Christ up on the cross. And this big wave of evil was coming and was going to crash over him. But through his death and sacrifice and resurrection, he drove back the wave of evil forever. And I remember I was staying with my dad at the time, sitting on his couch, and I read that, and I got it. I got it.
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay.
Wow.
Here is someone talking about evil in a way that feels true, it feels authentic, it feels honest, and that addresses what I've seen.
Right.
So I was really struck by that. And so the next 2 books I bought Mere Christianity, which was the only book about Christianity that I knew somehow. Is that the same C.S. Lewis who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It is. Oh my goodness. So I read that, and I read the Screwtape Letters, and that was in summer of 2020. And I remember saying at the time that it felt like the first time anyone had spoken to me about Christianity like I was an adult. And so I read both those books and contacted my friends in Coeur d'Alene. I went up to go see them Labor Day weekend, 2020, and I asked them to baptize me. And I knew going into that like, here's the first spiritual or religious tradition that I've been a part of where I have to make an affirmative commitment to the faith. It can't just be like, oh, I casually practice Buddhism. I'm speaking that I would like to be part of this, and my word is my commitment. And that was how I regarded my baptism. So,
oh, that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible to hear how God deals with people. But I think your story is just is really incredible on almost every metric. And yeah, I'm just grateful that we could sit here today and have Christ in common. The most common thing. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, you've also had a very keen interest in masculinity over the years. You've done some pretty incredible work. I think at some point you did a documentary. Was it called The Renaissance of Man, or
was it was going to be called The Renaissance Man? Yeah.
Okay. And you spent some time talking to very prominent people in sort of the Manosphere.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I found that very interesting. Well, what prompted that interest in masculinity? What prompted even you wanting to do a tour like that? Where did that begin?
I love the questions you ask me. Thank you. So my interest in masculinity started right around the same time as I discovered the desire to travel.
Okay.
So this was 2000, 2001 in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
I had done a .com startup that ended, and I went back to school to finish my degree at Stanford.
Okay.
So
what was your degree in?
It was in communication.
Okay, in communication. Yeah.
Surprise.
Yeah.
So I went back to school to finish up. I had a year left, and I took a class on Jungian psychology.
Okay.
And that was my exposure to the ideas of Carl Jung. And it was during that class, the Lord of the Rings movies were just about to come out at that time, I believe. And the professor was talking about the Lord of the Rings and how the characters of the Fellowship all represent different aspects of masculinity.
Right.
And I found that to be really compelling because I had grown up in a culture that told me that if I wasn't into pizza, beer, and football, as a man, that I was broken.
Right.
And I really believed that. Like there must be something just broken about me as a man. But when I took this class and the professor explained to me it was in Jungian terms, archetypes that are illustrated in the Fellowship. You have the archetypal hero of Aragorn versus someone like Frodo.
Right.
And you have Gandalf, the wise, and you have Sam and Merry Pippin, etc. None of these men are looking at each other and saying, I don't think you're man enough. Right?
Yeah.
None of them are.
Yeah.
They all accept each other as different pieces of the puzzle towards moving towards a desired goal.
Right.
And I remember learning that and thinking that was so, I'll say profoundly healing.
Yeah.
Because it showed me that there was more than one valid way to be a man. I didn't just have to be the frat boy. Sure. Right? I could be a many different versions, particularly, well, what does that mean for me? If I'm not broken, if I'm not that, what does it mean to be, we'll say, whole? Yeah. And so that stuck with me. And so what it means to be a man was something that I had sort of been thinking about over the next decade or so. And then in 2013, I discovered a weekend men's initiation called the Mankind Project, the new warrior training adventure. Someone casually posted about it on Facebook. It's like, that sounds interesting. He posted, today I begin my new warrior training adventure. I was like, what's that? That sounds like something I would do. And so I went on this weekend men's initiation. And on this weekend retreat, there were 50 men who were initiates, and there were about 100 men on staff, something like that. And they had run this with 60,000 men around the world. And so here I was looking at this room full of men, all different walks of life, right? All different socioeconomic backgrounds, for all I know, all different religious traditions, and all of them were struggling with the same questions that I was. What does it mean to be a man? And I realized that I wasn't alone in that question. And that really struck me, like, what's going on here? 60,000 men around the world. So I participated in a lot of men's groups. So just men sitting in a circle together, just talking about our lives, being able to process what's going on with us. Some of them facilitated by therapists, some not. And I got to see that this question was far more pervasive than I realized. And the Mankind Project, the traditions that informed it go all the way back to the 1980s with a man named Robert Bly. He wrote a book called Iron John, very pagan, but he made some insightful observations about the nature of what it means to be a man. He did a series a show on PBS. I can't remember the name right now, but it became just this nationwide sensation. People were ordering video cassettes through the mail because you couldn't just pull up the internet and watch it at the time. So it was so popular in the 80s, men were just ordering these video cassettes because it spoke to this deep longing of what it means to be a man as far back as the 80s. And so I carried on doing that. And that is part of what led me to go to Burning Man. That's part of what led me to exit from the relationship that was not going anywhere because I recognized that I wanted a wife and kids, and the relationship I was in was not going that way. It was not possible to go that way. So I recognized in myself as early as then that the desire to be a husband and a father is not bad or toxic, that all this feminism that I had just been marinating in was a lie, and I found the strength to fight for something that was true within me as a man. It was very difficult. It was had huge consequences in my social circles, but what are you going to do? So then while I was traveling, that's when I first encountered what many people know as the Manosphere through some YouTube videos in 2018. And so I found this group of men online, influencers who were talking about money, muscles, and women. That's probably a good way. The things of men's outer lives. So you have that. And then I thought back to my time in the Mankind Project, and they talked about grief and trauma, quote unquote, and shame, stuff like overcoming that, and virtue. Right. Virtue would probably be the best way to put it. So you have men's inner lives with the Mankind Project, but they don't talk about money. They don't talk about finance, none of that stuff. But then you have men's outer lives with the Manosphere, but they don't talk about grief or anything like that. So you have one group is talking about men's outer lives, one's talking about men's inner lives, and they don't seem to know about each other. And this has been going on for 40 years. So what if I tried to bring those two halves together and let them know about each other? So that was why I started the Renaissance of Men in summer of 2020. And that was why I attempted to produce the documentary to help highlight for the American public the number of online influencers talking about these two halves of masculinity, making them aware of each other and making the American culture, the West, aware of this cultural conversation.
The documentary never actually came out then.
No, it was intended to be a 7-part, like Netflix-style documentary series. I recorded, I did a road trip across the U.S. in summer of 2021, drove 14,000 miles, recorded 25 interviews and 60 hours of footage plus. But it needed funding. I self-funded it to kind of get it off the ground. I tried to raise additional funds with one of the top raisers in the world, was unsuccessful. But I did end up producing a 20-minute kind of overview of what it would have been about. But it was meant to be a much longer project.
Amazing. An interesting question for you here, Will. You traveled around the world. You've seen various kinds of civilizations around the world.
Or lack thereof.
What did you observe about masculinity in each of those places you visited? And to what degree did you see whatever you saw regarding masculinity influence the way those civilizations were built or run at the time?
This might be contradictory to some, but I believe that most cultures outside of the West are actually matriarchal. I believe that they, on the surface, they have a shallow machismo form of masculinity, but that's ultimately not patriarchal, grounded in responsibility and leadership. It will work, it'll be present, it'll be flashy and flaunty, but ultimately it's a grown sort of man-boyness where I think the women either publicly or privately rule the home, right? In ruling in the sense that like they are in charge of their husbands, as opposed to the husband, leads the family and leads the culture. So that's one of the things that I saw that was very difficult for me to understand at first, because I had been led to believe that the whole world was this giant masculine, patriarchal kind of oppression of women. Right. But as I started asking questions about particularly culture in China, et cetera, the Dragon Mother as a meme, or other cultures in Africa, I think you can probably speak to that. That's like, these are actually matriarchal cultures that are very fixed.
Right.
They don't have the ability to advance because there's no vision to advance to.
Right.
So that was a big thing that I learned. And then coming into Christianity and understanding post-millennialism, ideas like that, understanding God's design for men, God's design for women, and understanding that was the root that planted so much Western prosperity. It was living in alignment with God's law. Like, look, you can try it this way and you will see what happens, or you can try it the other way and see what happens then too. Coming to understand that was a really big deal that happened after.
Absolutely. One of the things that I've observed in Africa, and I know this is true of other countries, is just fatherlessness being a very, very serious issue.
Yeah.
Actually, statistically, you still have men who are around, they have kids, but they're not really involved.
That's
It's kind of what you're speaking to in terms of this very matriarchal culture, where the women essentially run everything, essentially do everything. They're the ones who boss everyone around, right? And I think what that's done is it's created an effeminized culture, right? And you can't really build anything great with an effeminized culture at all.
That's right.
To what degree do you see that bleeding into the U.S.? What are your big concerns about the way this is taking hold of the U.S., assuming you believe that that's actually the case? But.
Yeah, I think there's a counter reaction to that. I think we were strongly heading in that direction.
Right.
As Pastor Doug Wilson says, we were expending all of our Christian cultural capital, and I think the bank account was running pretty low. So I would say that I saw that taking hold in the United States, and the question is around accountability.
Right.
That is always a question. So if the mother is ruling, if you're living in a matriarchal society, who is she ultimately accountable to? Is she accountable to a high priestess? Not usually. It's usually the mother ends up being accountable to no one or to her circle of friends, to the extent that we want to call that accountability.
Right. Yeah.
So it's very siloed, right? Now, we had that beginning to develop in the United States. In fact, I think there was a legitimate attempt to make that in the United States. I think they did a pretty good job.
Right.
You have generations of women who don't understand the notion of accountability.
Right.
And we can certainly talk about that.
Yeah.
But now what we're having is a counter reaction to that that's flipping over into sort of, I don't know what the term is, but it's not masculinity. It's a hyper form of masculinity. I don't like the term toxic masculinity because I think it's incomplete.
Right.
I think there are two kinds of toxic masculinity. The first kind of toxic masculinity is the machismo, fragile, a big ego, small spine kind of guy, right? That everyone can identify. But I think that there's another form of toxic masculinity that is the weak, frail man who saps the energy of his environment because he doesn't step into his life. Yes. I think those are two different versions of toxic masculinity. So what we're seeing as the counter reaction to this matriarchal movement is this sort of, I don't like hyper patriarchy. I don't really know what the great word is, but I think you know what I'm describing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those men are equally unaccountable. Right. They're like, who are they ultimately accountable? Are they accountable to their bros? That's not good.
Yeah.
Right. And they have to be accountable to a higher power. And that higher power, God, Christ, gives them very clear and specific guidelines and rules for how they are to conduct themselves in private and in public and in their thoughts, words, and actions. So are you ultimately accountable to that standard? You will stand before a righteous judge.
Yeah.
Do you believe that? Because if you do, you will behave very differently.
Exactly.
Men who reject that, inwardly or outwardly, they fall into just as deep a ditch as the women who reject it as well.
Yes, exactly. What happened to your relationships as you became a Christian?
Right.
in this manosphere world?
Yeah.
Did they improve? Did you lose some of those relationships? And just with yourself as well. I mean, I'm kind of loading you with a ton of questions here, but sometimes there's this notion that Christianity produces weak men, right? And there's some merit to that concern, just because pastors have failed some of the young men in their churches, and they've had to sort of outsource any sort of masculine influence to people in the manosphere. You think of the Jordan Petersons. I think that's how he got a hold. Andrew Tate, that's how he got a hold. Various other people. So what was that like for you? Having this really strong desire to see masculine men, but now you're also a Christian, and so you understand that masculinity can only really truly rest
right
on a Christian foundation.
Correct.
Right. Was that difficult for you to reconcile? And yeah, did that change some of your relationships?
It did.
Mm-hmm.
So my family is very liberal. My friends were all very liberal. In fact, I was once very liberal.
Yeah.
I campaigned for Obama in 2008. I campaigned for Obamacare in San Francisco in 2010. I was also part of Occupy Wall Street in San Francisco in 2010 and 2011. So I was pretty hard on the left. This was pre-woke though.
Yeah.
Woke was not really a thing at the time.
Yeah.
I was protesting the corruption of the big banks that crashed the financial system, and I think that that's a universal value. But at the time, it was on the left. So as I began to become conservative, travel overseas made me a conservative real quick.
Yeah, right.
Because I went down to, for example, Latin America, to Colombia, and in Colombia, there's like the sex expectations, the gender expectations are the same as they've always been. In fact, Latin American people are very proud that men are men and women are women, and they wear that on the outside. And the men are expected to act like men, maybe not like virtuous, righteous, godly men, but still what we'd identifiably masculine. Machismo is the word, and women are expected to act like women. They're supposed to look and behave feminine, and they enjoy it. And so when I got to Latin America, and I discovered that feminism was not this galactic imperative. That was like, whoa, right? Yeah. Okay, so what else? What else is going on? Because there was no way to argue with it. And again, with my liberal woke programming, it's like, well, these are these minority quote unquote cultures, so they're right. Like, wait, what? Right? So as I started moving away from liberalism towards conservatism, particularly following the 2016 election, that definitely challenged a lot of my relationships with my family members. As I began speaking more about masculinity, that began challenging my relationships with family members and friends. And then when I became a Christian, that I would say that those relationships are, let's say I pray for us to be in contact again. I'm still very much in touch with my dad. Spoke to him yesterday. He's been nothing but supportive. He gave me one of my first Bibles for my birthday. He himself is not a Christian, but he had it and gave it to me for my birthday. So I'm still very much in touch with him. But the rest of my family, I haven't heard from them a couple years, and I haven't yet gone on a crusade to reclaim my Facebook page. So I'm sort of thinking about how I'm going to do that, because I haven't posted on Facebook in a
long time,
5 years maybe. But I would like to see. I have had someone reach out to me that I knew in San Francisco who said, "Yeah, I'm a Christian as well." And we ended up striking up a conversation. So that there has been signs of support. In fact, there was a man that I met in the DJ world. We met in Miami at this big DJ conference, and he also grew up Jewish, very Jewish. He became a Christian as well. And so he and I connected and talked on the phone. And so I was like, oh my gosh, what is it? So there have been bright spots and all that, but it's definitely challenged a lot of my relationships. And I haven't been aggressively evangelistic about it. I haven't been like, repent, sinners. You know what I mean? It's just been sharing my testimony. And it's been challenging to see the way that people I cared about have interpreted my testimony personally to them. And so I pray for the opportunity to try again.
Let's dial this up a little bit here, Will.
Let's go.
Let's talk about Stone Choir.
All right.
How much should we hate the Jews, Will?
On a scale of 1 to 10?
On a scale of 1 to 10.
We shouldn't hate anybody. We shouldn't hate anybody.
You speak about growing up in a Jewish household.
Sure.
We talked about masculinity as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in recent times, especially, there seems to be this resurgence of a very anti-Jewish sentiment.
Correct.
Right? Where do you think this comes from? Of course, you have an interesting story around the whole Stone Choir thing, which I'd love you to get into as well.
Sure.
And just kind of give us your take on what you make of this anti-Semitic resurgence of sorts.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, let's go back to the garden. Right. So God gave Adam 3 jobs: to tend, to keep, and to teach. We can infer the teaching because Eve knew about the prohibition against eating from the tree. So we can infer that Adam taught her that. Perhaps not well, but he still taught her. So to tend, to keep, and to teach. Tend is to cultivate, to create prosperity. Keep is protect.
Right.
So we can call this protect and provide. This is what men do. This is what we're made to do. This is what God made us to do. And so you can look at civilization building as a process of being very successful in protection and provision.
Right.
Not only have we protected the environment from threats inside and outside so that we have safety, we've been able to cultivate to the point that we have excess wealth to build palaces and monuments and art and all that. So protect and provide to such an astounding degree that you've created so much surplus that you can create high civilization. So when America was victorious in World War II, we had protected and kept to the highest degree, perhaps in human history.
Right.
Certainly in recent memory, right? The highest degree in human history. And so I think that there was an idea at the time, there was because Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History.
Right.
This idea like, well, congratulations, guys, we did it.
Yeah.
Smooth sailing from here. Let's just cruise and collect seashells, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a definite, and it was hard to argue,
right? Because
you look at the prosperity of 1940s and 1950s America, and truly everything that came later, and then this massive rush of cheap prosperity in the 1980s with money printing and Chinese-made goods, right? And so you had this, and the dual income households facilitated by abortion and no-fault divorce, stuff like that. So you had this flood of prosperity that kind of lulled everyone to sleep. We've made it, guys. Smooth sailing from here. End of history. Let's go.
Yeah.
So men, fathers, forgot that they needed to teach. Right. That was their third job.
Yeah.
Protection was taken care of by the police, by the fire, by nuclear weapons, by disarmament treaties, by the government. Protection has now been outsourced to the government, local and federal, right? State, local, and federal. Provision has been taken care of by this massively industrialized culture. Just go to college and get a good job and you're good. That was the message that was delivered to me. You just have to find your place in the system of economics and you're fine.
Yeah.
So what is there left to teach? So fathers, beginning, I would say probably in the 1960s and onwards, abdicated in their responsibility to teach. They outsourced that to the school as well, to the schools, public schools.
Wow.
And so just because fathers quit on their job to teach doesn't mean that boys don't need to learn.
Right.
So remember earlier I talked about how this cassette from Robert Bly was massively popular, ordered through the mail in the 1980s. That was because as early as the 1980s, the baby boomer generation, who at that point would be probably in their late 30s, early 40s, they were beginning to realize that there were things about masculinity that their fathers hadn't taught them. Right? As early as then.
Yeah.
So where did they go? They turned to a wise old pagan man, who gave them poetry and songs and mixed in with a lot of mysticism to begin telling them who they are as men. That's how early that phenomenon appeared. So you run that forward, plus 20 years to the birth of the internet. You've now escalated that where the one generation of fathers didn't teach the next generation, and the next generation didn't know they needed to teach their sons.
Right.
And so you have this very wealthy, prosperous, safe, secure, so to speak, society of boys that haven't learned anything from their dads about what it means to be a man. And now you give them the internet. The free flowing of of all the information of human history is now available to you on demand. And there's no tools that are given to men to discern truth from lies, right? Because we've lost an objective standard of truth. Everything is hyper-relativized. So what you have is a bunch of young men who still need to learn about, we'll say, money, muscles, and women, right? They still need to learn how to protect, how to provide, and how to teach. They didn't learn it from their fathers because their fathers didn't learn it. So they turned the internet to learn how to do these things. That's where you get Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, Rollo Tomasi, Fresh and Fit, the influencers that you spoke about with Aaron Wrenn. What you also get in that world very quickly is you get into the realm of conspiracy theories, right? Now, I found my way into that world in 2013, right around the same time as I went on my men's initiation retreat. So I have often reflected on it was an awakening in many senses. And so I'm a quick study, I read a lot. So I went diving into that world, right? Enough to learn that everything that we've been told is a lie, right? So I got time to go through that and get a lot of it out of my system, but still carried a lot of it. Now, a lot of people didn't go through that process until 10 years later, 7 years later in 2020. 2020 was the awakening for a lot of people, men, women, fathers, husbands, pastors, elders, that like, okay, this is all a lie.
Right.
We've been lied to at a international scale by everything around us.
Right.
And so that was when they woke up to the lies. And so what we're experiencing now is a lot of people having ingested a lot of alternative information that has a lot of truth to it. And we'll talk about that.
Sure.
But it's also laced with poison.
Yeah.
And that's where I think you can understand Stone Choir.
Right.
Stone Choir is providing a lot of information to a lot of men that their fathers, pastors did not provide to them, right? But when you take true information and you lace it with poison, it becomes a lie, and it becomes deeply poisonous to the body and to the spirit.
Right.
And that's how you can understand not just them, but many others in this media ecosystem right now.
Yeah.
So maybe we can start there.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great place to start, because I think you've provided a very elaborate diagnostic of where this stems from.
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know why Jews though? Like,
sure.
and why do you think there's something to having to this need to sort of have someone to blame for everything?
Correct.
Like, where does that stem from? And why the Jews?
Sure. I can give you what I think is the answer.
Yeah.
I think the question why the Jews applies more specifically in the Christian context.
Right.
I think we can answer it more precisely there.
Yeah.
I think every civilization struggles with a different enemy. So right now, in this particular moment we're in, it appears to be the Jews. But if you run it back to the 1980s, it was the Russians. Right? Let's not forget the Cold War. They were the big bad guys behind everything.
Right.
Quite a lot of spy novels and stuff were written, about then. And then also, I think you can look back and like, who did people say the enemies were in the first half of the 20th century? Every culture has to pick its enemy to define itself as an us versus them. In this Christian context, now you spoke about with Aaron Wren about the number of men who are flooding back into church. And he very wisely said that a lot of these men have been discipled by the internet. And so it's a different cultural conversation. I think that was a very great point that he made. And so a lot of men are coming into the Christian world and they're identifying the Jews, the Pharisees' enmity to Christ in the New Testament as the initial break point when the Jews themselves turned against Christ, who was the foundation of Western civilization. So you have this root planted that's the foundation of Western civilization, all of our prosperity. The Jews then had decided that they were at war, right, with Christ. And so you run that forward 2,000 years, and now they've taken on that, they've fully assumed that mantle in a way that perhaps hadn't quite been the case. But they the people who do talk about the Jews being the enemies of civilization, they do run that back to historical events that are much, much older. But in this particular context, that's why it's so virulent within the Christian community to say these are the blood enemies of Christians, right? That's the root of it there.
Right. What would your response be? What has it been to that assertion?
Sure.
How should Christians be thinking about this?
Yeah, I think Doug Wilson makes a great point that if you're going to single out an entire group of people, you must also acknowledge the good that they did. And I think it is without doubt that many Jews have contributed very productively to Western civilization through the centuries, right? And I think that we can see that today, whether it be neurosurgeons, musicians, it's that artists, right? Or you talk about you can talk about all the scientific discoveries, like Albert Einstein is a great example.
Right.
Yes, Albert Einstein believed in Baruch Spinoza's God, but he still did come up with a mathematical equation to convert matter into energy, which contributed to nuclear power, which contributed to a lot of the prosperity that we have today, right? And so you can look and you can see these and you can say, as Doug Wilson does, that yes, when Jews are very good, they are indeed very good. And when Jews are very bad, they are indeed very bad.
Yeah.
But why? And so I did a video, I did an interview with Dr. Mark Musser, who wrote a book, Nazi Ecology, sort of about the pagan nature worshiping kind of philosophies that informed National Socialism. At the front end of that interview, I did a 45-minute or so monologue, sort of talking about some of these issues. And at the end, a lot of people didn't listen to the whole thing. At the end, I explained how one of the things that Jews have that I can say that I grew up with, and so did the man I talked to, the former DJ who had become Jewish as well. We have, and I described it this way, family-driven cultures of elite level competence. Meaning that when I was a kid, being a doctor or lawyer was that's it.
Yeah.
Like I had one job. My job was to get into an elite level university and become a doctor or a lawyer.
Right.
And that's very real.
Yeah.
Right. And so that there's no plan B, right? Burn the ships. That's what you're going to do. And everything else takes a back seat.
Right.
Everything else, like camping, travel, sports, like play sports because it's good for you because you need to be around other boys. And I was good at baseball as a kid, but like that was completely less important than A+, 4.0 plus GPA, period. And you know, I think back to some of my fellow students and they were involved in dance and theater while still achieving highly in school because that was the expectation. Right. And so my question then is like, okay, where's your expectation for your kids and for yourself?
Right.
Because we have a very complicated, very sophisticated technological society. You're not going to run it with memes, right? You have to sit down and you have to study and you have to work and you have to achieve either to build new institutions or take them back. Right. Now I understand that it's difficult, but I can't say that it's any more difficult than how it was in civilization when Genghis Khan was invading.
Right.
So if you want to stack up, quote unquote, again, quote unquote, the Jews, we're saying this phantom enemy that controls everything. If you want to stack up that challenge to Genghis Khan, the Huns, I don't think that you can. You can say this is our particular institutional technological challenge now.
Yeah.
And it's far better than being invaded by sword-wielding marauders, right? And so you can rise to that challenge.
Right.
And I think Christians have a responsibility to rise to that challenge. And that is the beauty of the postmillennial vision. Right. It's not, as Pastor Doug Wilson said yesterday in the opening of the new building for Christ Church, we have lived in a Christian eschatological context that sees the sun setting, see the sun's going down. Yeah. And Doug Wilson, a beautiful sermon, said, no, the sun's actually rising, right? And so when we begin thinking that way, that we're living in an age where the sun of Christ is actually rising and cannot be stopped, you can yell at the sun, it's still going to keep coming up, right?
Yeah.
It cannot be stopped.
Yeah.
What are you going to do in the light of that day? Are you going to rise to the challenge or are you going to get angry on the internet? Because you only have so much time and energy in the day. Yeah. And so where are you putting your energy? Yeah. And the last thing I want to say about this is my experience in the Manosphere has showed me that anger is an intoxicant.
Wow. Yeah.
The Christian cultural conversation in the reform space right now is trying to treat this as a political issue. Like it's about politics, left versus right. It's not. I don't see it that way. It's closer to substance addiction.
Wow.
Like men imbibe this information, they imbibe this content, including from Stone Choir, and they get angry and they get addicted to their own anger. Because they've been so passive for so long that this bolt of anger into their body, which comes as a form of stress hormones and testosterone, bolts them up out of the ditch that they were in. Yeah. It drives them very quickly into the next ditch, but they feel this rush of momentum as they come up out of the ditch. I watched that in the Manosphere. It's not sustainable. Right. It'll get you out of the ditch, but if you don't cut off it, it's going to drive you into the next ditch. Exactly. And so this is a substance addiction problem for men, and Andrew Tate tapped into it as well. Right. And I can't tell you the number of men who have reached out to me after I pulled the episode with Stone Choir, after I repented for it publicly and dealt with all of that. Yeah. So many men have reached out to me, husbands, fathers, even pastors of other denominations, saying, Will, they said almost these exact words, Will, I was listening to Stone Choir. I found myself getting really angry all the time, and it was affecting my relationships and my home, and I didn't know what was going on, and I finally stopped listening, and it went away. Wow. So I don't know what it was, but thank you for speaking out. So I think that there's a particular form of anger, substance addiction, and fuel that men are getting addicted to, and they're driving their lives into a ditch.
Exactly. Well, thank you for speaking to that so profoundly. I wish we had more time.
Sure.
I really wish we had more time. But well, thank you. I think this conversation has been rich. I think it's given and provided a lot of depth for people, recognizing just how important and necessary belief in Christ is.
I agree.
For a meaningful life, for a meaningful masculinity.
Right.
And for meaning even to sort of utilize the present moment, and not giving way, conceding to anger and lies, but to build their lives on the foundation of truth.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, God bless you, Will. I hope we can do this again soon.
Thank you, Lennox.
Yeah, thank you very much.